Welcome back to the show, everybody. I'm here with Jason Yarusi out of Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm really excited for this interview. Jason's a guy who's been in real estate for a while, and he transitioned from residential investor to commercial investor. And I believe you moved from New Jersey to Tennessee, correct?
That is correct. Yeah, just over a year now.
That's awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to getting into your journey. I really appreciate you coming on the show as a guest. So before we get into the nuts and bolts, can you give the listeners a little bit about your background and what you did before you got into the real estate industry?
Yeah, sure. So as said, Yarusi Holdings is our multifamily investment firm. We've done a little over 1,100 multifamily units since we transitioned into this, starting back in 2016. Prior to that, my wife, Pili, and myself, we actually were living in New York City, and that's where we met, running bars, opening bars and restaurants and breweries, just a different stage to our life, but it set us up for a lot of understandings of scaling businesses and just how to work with a lot of different players, right? And so that was a lot of fun. However, Hurricane Sandy happened back early, 2011, and my dad was in New Jersey, has a construction company that was always focused on really lifting and moving buildings. And that was really set up for when the storm happened. There was such a need for these houses to be lifted to hopefully not flood in the future and meet the FEMA guidelines that now were put in place on hundreds and thousands of homeowners. So my brother was working for me at the time. Of course, Pili, we went out to New Jersey to really just help dad just take that business from where he was busy, but he was doing 12, 13 projects a year. Just, you can imagine large projects that are moving houses to now doing hundreds of projects a year. And it was a very busy couple of years. But what came out of that is that just like when we were in the bar business into the construction business, is that we were basically trading our time for dollars, right? Just like anything here, where if you're out there providing service, the service doesn't pay dividends, right? Well, it does for the accomplishment of the fact, but in terms of financial, is that if you're not doing the work, then there is no monetary incentive that carries forward just based on you thinking about the work. So we had to get back to the narrative that we wanted to control our day, control our time, and just set our intentions on how we could do that forward. Pili was pregnant at the time with our first child, and here we are, so busy with construction, and great to help Pop, but we want to set that new way where we can make sure that, okay, I want to spend time with my kid. Okay, I can go do that, whether it be Tuesday or Sunday, right? I could set that narrative. So we thought we did what was logical at the time was we got into real estate. However, we got into a very active capacity. Pili started, got a real estate license. We started flipping, wholesaling, doing a lot of things that now here we are really busy helping dad. And now we've just put busy on top of busy on top of busy. And now we're like, wow, we're going further away from it. So into that journey, we discovered buying rentals out of state. And where that empowered us is that when we were buying these rentals out of state, it aligned us that we couldn't be active in going out there to do the work because we're 1,000 miles away. So we had to get back to our roots of when we were setting up things to empower others to be part of the process where they can help the business plan without me having to actively go out there and do anything that was physically involved there, and allowed us to see that light. However, they were small properties, right? It was 2 units, 3 units, 4 units, right? But the
what area were you buying in? Because you're from New Jersey. What markets were you going and buying these like smaller rentals out of state in?
Yeah, sure. First market was Indiana. So we went over to Indiana, a few places just around in and around Indianapolis there. And it was a good lesson learned. And honestly, it worked well. However, the scalability point right there, it was just like, well, how do you scale that, right? You're going to be scaling with a bunch of these like all over town. It just seemed like a logistical nightmare. So we were there, but not quite yet. Yeah. And it came upon us that, wow, okay, what else is there? Well, we came upon large apartment investing, and it was like that moment where you're like, aha, got it, right? If you can do that on a 2 unit, why can't you do it on a 50 unit or 100 unit? Yeah. And where you see the difference, unlike, flipping homes or other points, it takes out the feeling or like the buyer point where it's like, oh, I don't like the paint color, other points. You can get to look at the building and treat it like a business and accomplish things where if you can make it a better community to live, right? Go in there and fix all the repairs and stop all the leaks for tenants, which they don't want. Well, that ramification there, right, can help your business run better, create more revenue, cut down on your expenses, create more bottom line growth there. And then in fact, everybody benefits from that. And so seeing that model, it was one of those points where we said, okay, that's it. let's dive in, let's learn everything we can, right? Shut off the blinders. And that's one of the hard things in life and real estate is that there's so many great avenues you can take, and none are, they all can be right depending on who you are. However, you have to shut the blinders off. And we did, and we said, okay, let me go all in, learn as much as I can, surround myself with others and see how they're doing it successfully, and see how I can follow that model to the success that we want to have.
Yeah, that's always a smart way to do it, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, going out and modeling someone who's already successful. Now, I have a few follow-up questions for you on why you picked apartments over other commercial assets, because, people get into the business and it's like the typical, I call this the typical real estate investor sequence. It's like, usually they start out and they're like in a situation where they want to make a change, whether they're young or old. They learn about wholesaling, which I've heard has been called the crack of real estate, because it's easy and quick, right? And it feels good. Not saying I've smoked crack before, but and then they get into flipping houses, which is usually more lucrative, but there's more problems. Then they buy single family rentals, and they realize pretty soon they're very hard to cash flow. And I could talk about that for 10 hours. And then they say, I want to do apartments. And then they go do apartments. And then usually that's where they stay. So what made you gravitate towards apartments over triple net leases, self-storage facilities, industrial buildings? Because there's a lot of people doing a lot of things, mobile home parks. I mean, there's a lot of them, right? So what about apartments did you and your wife really enjoy?
It stood out that was the first thing that came in front of us. So why those could all be good models, you have to stop somewhere, right? Because where do you stop, right? And so when you look at apartments, you have cash flow, appreciation, depreciation, debt pay down, tax advantages, portfolio diversification, right? You can have all these elements there that not everyone will have, right? And some will miss on the narrative, right? And so it just made sense to me, because I was basically looking at like, okay, right now we're basically buying a bunch of like 5-seat, 10-seat restaurants and saying, okay, how can we maximize this, right? But you still have that set point of your rent, your cost fixed structure. You can't put a point. You can hire one employee, right? Compared to, okay, now same business plan, let's just go hire a 300 unit restaurant where I can hire all these people in here. I can have full-time employees, right? And that's what I saw in apartments, is that I can get a full-time team there. So no longer am I looking at it like a house. I'm more looking at it like a business. Like, okay, this is a business that's not performing, whether it's on the property side or, the management side. And, most of the time it's both. Or it just, it's not seeing all the angles that can be done there. How can I go in there and improve branding, improve operations, improve the quality of life, and make this a better place for all?
I like how you just mentioned that. And I really want the listeners to rewind what you just said, because that was almost like an aha moment I just had there. And I live, I've lived in apartment buildings, I moved to California, and, that there's a lot of them out here, right? So it's interesting how you just said that, because you're literally, you are buying a business, right? And that business has a great model behind it, AKA reoccurring revenue. And when you can go in and buy a business / building that has opportunity for upside, you will get rewarded handsomely financially, because you're taking a business that has potential, you're pumping the potential into it, and then everyone's benefiting: your investors, your tenants, or your customers, whatever you want to call them. And then your company, right? So, and that's a very great way to look at the apartment model, because a lot of people look at it just as another real estate investment. But at the end of the day, that's so true. It is totally a business. And I really like how you framed it that way, because I don't hear that very often. So I appreciate that.
You think about it, is that like when you have a bunch of people living there, you're going to have your perfect plan, and then you're going to have real life, right? Because you have 200 or 300 people living in an apartment complex. Like every day can change. However, how can I make this easy for them, right? Like, I don't know if you ever remember like the easy buttons they used to have at Staple. Like, how can
you push the button and
right?
That was easy.
And that was easy, right? Well, if you think back, like my first property we brought, like a 94 unit, to one we just brought at the end of the last year, a 76 unit. Same problems existed. Tenants were having a hard time with tenants paying rent. But they weren't the first one I brought. They weren't allowed to accept payments at the rental office, or the leasing office. They had to go down to some office 5 miles away, and no ACH.
Western Union or something, like something stupid.
It was
like
nuts,
that.
right? And then this last one we brought, the leasing office was open for 2-hour window, 1 day a week, right? So so it's not even easy for people to pay rent. So of course you think you're going to have trouble where people are like, well, I guess I'll get to it. I'll try to get there the Tuesday between 11 and 1 when they're randomly there on my lunch break to drop off rent because there was no like, it's just an insane narrative, right? But if you can think of, well, how can I just make that easy for the tenant? We'll open a leasing office. And sometimes that's all it takes, right? It's not so much the tenant on the pushback. It's just you're being an inconvenience to that tenant that maybe works overnight, that sleeps all night, or works during the day, or has to pick up their kids during that time, or I don't know, watching their favorite show. Who knows? But how can we make this easy on a tenant? Because you do that, and top down, everything starts trending back to, okay, great. You're collecting more rent. You're curbing it. You're giving the tenants a more reason to care because it looks like you're giving the care to it. Builds up your net operating income, which of course can build up your cash flow, which can now benefit your investors and so on.
That's awesome. No, that's such a good point too, because, I feel like I have rentals myself, right? I just sold a 4-unit and I have other single family condos and stuff like that. And I buy a lot of properties with bad tenants because that's how I get good deals, right?
Yep.
And it's amazing to see how the old landlords trained them on how to communicate, how to pay rent, how these people selected these people. We do evictions, right? We do evictions in New York and they're not fun, but It's amazing to see how the old way of doing things, how the old landlord would tolerate that, and obviously you're doing this at scale with larger buildings. And, when you're buying value add, it's expected, right? It's expected to have these problems. Now, I have a few questions for you about you're buying these. Now, you lived in New Jersey, so you were doing this totally virtually. Now, where you're buying real estate now, you're down in the Nashville area. Are you buying only in that like quasi southern area? Or are you buying all over the country? Like, what states do you not buy in? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, sure. So
maybe someone has
right now, we sold 5 assets last year, but in terms of everything we have on board, it's targeted to Nashville MSA, Atlanta MSA, Louisville MSA. We have one property up in Eastern PA, and we have one property with a new market in Little Rock, Arkansas. So that's
Eastern PA. We do some
Emmaus.
Is that by Allentown, Bethlehem,
right
Reading?
There, literally, you
like
drive right through.
Valley.
I actually went to Lehigh University, so
okay.
Great property over there. We did a cash out refi for investors last year. Fantastic property, right?
Yeah.
And that was it. But that was actually a couple of years into it. So we started, from New Jersey. Our first investment was in Louisville, Kentucky. Okay. But the important narrative there was that we had to put the team, the right team in the right place. Right. Because there's the internal team and the external team. Right. And your external team, unless you're vertically integrated, is your property management companies, your brokers, your bankers, your insurance people. Right. But your plan is what's going to get enacted. However, it goes on twofold. Right. Your plan is only as good as the people enacting it. Right. So you need to make sure you can empower that team to be in a position to do well. However, you also want their feedback too, that they're just not trying to please you and say, okay, we'll get it done when it's a plan that can't be accomplished, right? So if it's like, hey, go in there and raise rents $300 and bill back all the tenants $100 for utilities, and they're like, okay, we'll go get it done, right? And it's just not warranted in the market. You want their feedback to say like, okay, guys, let's look at a realistic game plan here of how we can implement a good plan, right?
Yeah,
and so it's a good plug and play.
Yeah, no, that's really smart. That's especially too, I've noticed like when I was back when I was really naive with rentals, like I thought, I would buy the rental and all of a sudden the tenant would just magically pay me market rent, right? Which was obviously a joke, right? Especially in New York. And this is like a little side note, but I've found that going forward, like states, hate to say it, California, New York, New Jersey, Seattle area, what's Washington, Oregon. I'm not really a big fan of buying properties there unless there's some sort of real incentive or something, because the tenant laws are so out of whack. I look at it as a lot of risk for me. And if I have investors, because if I can't get a tenant out of a house, if they're not paying, I still got to pay the bill. So do you avoid states like that because of that? Like, cause a lot of people like just don't buy in very difficult states for landlords, because it's a risk.
Well, you think about it, like we get back to the reverse of that easy button. Now is the state being the easy button on us, and no, it's not. Right. And it's also when you look at, let's say, multifamily properties or just properties in general, you want to look at, okay, what's controllable and what's not controllable.
Yeah. I love
right.
that.
And so you have macro factors, you have the micro factors, you have, ordinances, you have all these things that may be outside of your control.
Yeah.
But what can you control, right? On the property side, you can usually control the operation, control the narrative of that. Some of the things that are going to be outside your control, potentially taxes, insurance, utilities, right? So some of those parts of the mix. But if you look at, landlord friendly states, that's going to be a better place to operate. And we saw even with, COVID and it just, a lot of people just couldn't pay rent. A lot of people want to pay rent, and okay, cool. That those get worked with the landlords out there. But in states where people just see that there's no narrative, that they just may stop paying, and ultimately you're at that risk, right, for something that now you have no control over. And that's not a good place, especially if you're bringing on outside capital, where you have to find a way to weather that storm, right? So we look to not go into these states because they present undue risk, where we now have to take on some other layer, where if you ask me that question, like, hey, what do you do if this happens? And I can't give you a good response, because so if I'm in New Jersey and they say, okay, they lock down and they're going to do eviction, you have now, say you have a 20 unit building there, how would we react then? And it's that I couldn't give you a good response as an owner if I own there, because now I'm not in control of how
it's out of your control. Yeah. You can't control what Phil Murphy's going to dictate. You're like, I don't, and that's where, and I've noticed that, I've realized that, fortunately these are smaller properties, but if you have a bigger one, it's just, you're just going to have more, there's just more liability. If you had like a New York, I think New York's probably the worst state. Like New York City and San Francisco are probably, like, city wise, it's almost impossible to get a tenant out with the rent control. LA. But anyway, follow-up question besides that. Now, you're buying these properties, you're buying them somewhat locally, but, I've noticed that even buying a fix and flip or buying a BRRRR property, the due diligence that goes into that is relatively substantial too. So when you're buying, let's say, an 85 unit apartment building that has deferred maintenance, how much due diligence, like how much time do you have, like by the time you sign an LOI, which is just basically an agreement that you're going to buy a property, until you have to put some serious earnest money down? Because I can imagine with properties that are, in those areas, they could be on septic systems. There could be, like, there's a lot more due diligence that comes into, these buildings, because if there's a mistake, that could be, vital, or that could be, deadly, in terms of knowing what to do. Because that would be something that would scare me as a newer apartment guy.
What you got to do is you have to set. And so there's a common thought where, well, let me just try everything, because then something will hit, right? But what happens here is that you get all these things on, right? And you're like, okay, so now I have all these leads here, but you don't know, hey, is it a deal? It's like, well, I don't know, because now I'm doing like a apartment conversion to like a new construction to like a septic system apartment complex, to one from the 1940s to one from the 2010s, where you have to find a way to open and just create a box. But what that does is, say you had 100 leads you're looking at before. Okay, cool. But you have no idea, because they're all over the place, right? So you don't even know that you would need all these teams to assess all these different, building types, to understand how they all operate, for you to be able to make your proper analysis. So what we did is that we got really honed in on what we want, right? So we want buildings, BC assets built between 1975 and 2010, and let's say Louisville. So in the Southeast and South Central submarkets of Louisville, where I go. So we want to be into household incomes that are anywhere between 40 and 90, but really truly